Hello, welcome folks. We're going to give it just a moment for folks to trickle in. Welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Suzanna Hermans, co-owner of Oblong Books in the New York's Hudson Valley. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon, evening, whatever time it is where you are today. We are so excited to be hosting the launch event for Jeffrey Cranor and Janina Matthewson's You Feel It Just Below the Ribs. Their new novel came out today. Congratulations. And I am just really excited for this conversation, just like the past 5 minutes in the green room has been utterly fascinating. So I think we're all in for a real treat tonight. The conversation will be conducted by filmmaker Isa Mazzei. Thank you, Isa, for being here with us as well. And I am going to, in a moment, drop a link in the chat to we're shipping them today, to order a signed copy of the book. We mailed book plates all the way to England for Janina to sign for us, mailed them back. Jeffrey has signed them, so you'll actually get both authors, which is an impressive feat, I would like to say, on a across the pond book. So I'll drop that link in the chat, as well as a link to download the audiobook. If you have questions for our authors throughout the event, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to incorporate those as we go. I'm sure you are all big fans of Janina and Jeffrey, but if you don't yet know them, Jeffrey co-writes Welcome to Night Vale and Within the Wires podcasts. He also co-creates theater and dance pieces with his choreographer / wife, Jillian Sweeney. He comes from the New York area tonight. Janina Matthewson is the author of the novel Of Things Gone Astray and the novella The Understanding of Women. She co-writes Within the Wires and has also written for Murmurs, The Cipher, and Passenger List. She's originally from New Zealand, but she's coming to us from London. I will turn things over to you, and I'll be back at the end. Have a wonderful discussion and enjoy.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, guys, hello.
Hi.
And congrats on your book. It's awesome. I'm just gonna show it here. I loved it. I have to tell you, I went into it knowing nothing. I had listened to a little bit of Within the Wires, but I had no idea they were at all even remotely connected. And I have to say, I started reading it and I was like, oh, I'll, spend a few weeks on this. I killed it in like 3 days.
Yeah.
That is the best.
At the end, I remember I was laying in bed, it was 2 a.m. and I was like, stop reading. You need to save this. Savor. Don't, that feeling when you're hitting the end of a book and you just don't want it to end and then you're so sad. So like, good job. First of all, congrats. How does it feel having your book come out today? Are you like, is it exciting? Is it surreal?
It is both of those things. We were just talking earlier, Jeffrey and I both have backgrounds in theater, which is such a different experience because you ramp it all up and you have this moment of hype where you have opening night and it's all happening, and books aren't like that. You do all the work ages and ages ago and then suddenly you have to start marketing it, and like for me I have to like remember what we wrote what's in it because it feels so long ago. But yeah, it's really exciting. We've been talking about this book for years. I looked up my my Dropbox folder of the first documents I had for it, and they were from 2016 is when we first had a what if we did a book sort of talk. So it's really exciting to finally get here and have it be out there and have people be experiencing it and hopefully liking it.
Yeah. Yeah, we were talking about kind of missing that, that immediate response of like, even if it's just polite applause from a theater audience or whatever, because you're like, I did the thing. Now I'm here. I mean, the great thing, the thing I always remember about a book, you don't get that part of it. You don't get the immediate applause from people like reading it and immediately, giving you that feedback. But also like, I don't know, it's really exciting to think like it exists in the world now. Like this is a thing I made and it will just be around for however long, and people can get to it at their own time, their own speed. It's great. It feels really good. It's a weird, I don't know, Isa, how you feel as like as a filmmaker. Like, do you just like hold the DVD box in your hand or something? Like, do we still have DVDs like now that we're in streaming? Like, I just feel like there's something about having this physical object that's just unlike almost anything else that feels really great.
Yeah,
it's very true. I have to say the difference between my book and my first film, there is something tangible about the book that you just don't get with a movie. You can kind of hold the audience, but there's like that temporariness to it, you know. And I think it's pretty cool having a book to hold. So I understand that feeling. We actually have a first audience question, and I wanted to say that if any of you guys have any questions that come up as we're kind of chatting, just feel free to pop them, and we'll do our best to answer them. Do you guys have, this person wants to know, do you think they should listen to the audiobook or read the physical book? And I know that's kind of a personal question, but did you guys record the audiobook yourselves, or is there an actor who did that? And do you have a preference of one over the other that you recommend doing first?
I think this is interesting. Jeffrey and I do things differently. I very rarely listen to audiobooks, and he listens to them all the time. I think they are wonderful, but they're for me, they're a different experience because you have an actor also interpreting like book to reader is immediate. It's what we put on the page and then what you imagine in your head. And audiobooks have that other layer of like an actor's interpretation of the character as well, which is really interesting. And wonderful. Our audiobook is wonderful. We didn't do it ourselves. We have two incredible actresses narrating the book, whose names I'm going to blank on, but Jeffrey will know because they are our narrators because he already loved them. And
Kirsten Potter and Adapero Aduye.
Yes, and they're very, very good. So either way, go with your heart.
Yeah. This book was, I sent some I was an annoying guy emailing Caitlin over at HarperCollins, who handles all of their audiobook production, with like questions and thoughts on how the book should be done. Because it's footnoted and there's two different voices happening in this novel. And so I was poking her about, how are you handling the footnotes? Here's my idea. And she's like, I know how to do this. Yeah, absolutely. We'd already thought of this. We do hundreds of books. Hundreds of them.
Like, I am a professional.
And she did an amazing job. I haven't listened all the way through the audiobook, but I've been listening to it today some. And it's, the two voices are so distinct that I do think it's fairly easy to follow. I think with footnotes though, like I always recommend if you have time to read the actual physical book. I do think that's, for me, always the way to go. But audiobooks are really nice for doing dishes and mowing lawns and things.
Let's talk about the footnotes, because that is something I absolutely loved. Can you guys talk at all to like the development of, like, first of all, the idea to include the footnotes, and then also kind of the arc of the narrator of the footnotes? Because it's kind of like in the beginning, the footnotes feel very, very dry, very academic, as if they're kind of like this unbiased, truth filter. And then towards the end, they start to get very judgmental and kind of aggressive and almost mean. And you feel the person behind the footnotes almost like on this arc of their own. So can you talk a little bit more as to the footnotes?
Yeah, the footnotes, I think Jeffrey took a bit of convincing on the footnotes. I'm not sure, like that was I really wanted that to happen, and he was a bit like, oh, okay. But once we'd actually started writing them and he could see how they worked in my mind, I was not very good at describing them when I had the idea. And the way that she changes, I had Jeffrey reined me back a lot on how awful she gets toward the end. Well, not awful, but judgmental and opinionated and personal, because I think it's really interesting to look at how we like currently in society, how we think about academic writing and academic speaking as if it is infallible, and the appearance of education makes things seem like they are unassailable logic, but all of that is written by people and edited by people, and it all carries with it bias and context and all of that heavy weighted stuff that we all walk through every day. And I wanted to kind of unpick that a bit to make you feel by the end that these are being written by a person, not by, you know, an institution or anything like that. Like, it is always personal because it's always a person.
Yeah, we really we started the book from the place of found text, right? Like the idea that this manuscript was found after the writer had already died, and so that once you have that, like it didn't seem like enough, like as we talked longer, because once Janina kind of pitched the idea of the footnotes and put them out there, it was this realization from my point of view of like, oh yeah, because it's not enough just to say this book was found here, now read it, because that doesn't really feel like anything special. Like all books essentially are just found texts, if you think about it that way. And so having this other voice in there really serves to drive that point home. I also just love, like, I love playing with what the audience really thinks they want to believe too, you know, because oftentimes people are correct but not believable, and oftentimes, you know what I mean, like they sound right but they don't feel right, and I think there's a lot to the ways in which we judge what is truth and what is not.
Yeah, I loved that tension in the book, and I loved how it really kind of made you evaluate the contrast between like the truth of personal experience and the truth as history that we remember it, or history as we learn it. And I think that tension that's really present in the book is also very like relevant to conversations that we have today around like how we remember our own lives or our own experiences versus what maybe other people are telling us of their experiences or of like factual history. And so I think that part for me was really interesting, especially towards the end when there is like so much more tension between the author and the footnotes, and you really feel them kind of butting perspectives.
I like that comes through too, because it's a dialogue between two characters who don't exist in the same place or time, which is really it's a really tough balance to get right. So it feels good that comes through, that it does feel a little bit like a dialogue, that tension gets built a little bit.
It absolutely does. I really enjoyed it. One thing I was curious about, given I work with co-writers a lot, but never on a book. And I just was wondering, like, personally, I'm just curious, like, what is your process like working together? Like, is it similar to writing on the podcast together? Did you have to kind of change how you worked together on the book? Were you kind of passing each other pages? Were you working in the same room or on Zoom? Or like, what is your process like, both as individuals and together, and how has that kind of developed?
It was pretty similar to the podcast. We've been working together now for a really long time, since 2015, I guess, on the podcast. And so we have a rhythm kind of down, a pretty chaotic one because we're both kind of chaotic people. But we talk over Zoom or whatever, and work through ideas and discuss things and bounce back, and then we tend to go away and write an outline, and then bring those two together and talk about them again, and then we end up with like as detailed an outline as we can get before we go out and start writing actual episodes or chapters, so that we know what what we're doing and what we're aiming for and where we're going, and then we come back and we swap and we edit and we rewrite and we talk it through again. So it's by this point I'd like to say it's a well-oiled machine, but I don't think either of us will ever build a well-oiled machine for any reason, but it works, it functions.
You did it. You made a whole book.
We did it.
And a very successful podcast.
Yeah, it's fun having that back and forth, like that over a slow period of time, because we sort of broke the book up into the book is in 4 parts, and we both kind of like captained 2 parts each, sort of thing. And it's as you sort of like work your way through the outline to fill out full chapters, full stories, and you can pass those back and forth. You can then go through and kind of Janina will go through and like kind of punch up the language, or like take a story that I started in but didn't really flesh out and be like, I actually like this. I kind of want this to be more involved here. I think this actually works really well. And then we can have like shared documents on Google. You can fill it full of comments to be like, I don't understand why you deleted this whole section. I really like this section. And then we can get on
How
Zoom.
dare you?
Yeah. Yeah. We had a few how dare you comments and conversations and, work them out.
Yeah.
Jeffrey has this really good philosophy actually that he talked about a bit when we were writing this, that from obviously he's been co-writing stuff for years. I mean, we both have collaborative backgrounds, but his thing is, there's always, whenever there's a disagreement, it's not just a balance of like what you think, it's a balance of who really, like how strongly you feel about things and how strongly the other person thinks about that. And that's a starting point for when you like compromise on stuff, which I think is really helpful. And yeah.
I worked in a theater company for many years in New York City called the Neo Futurists, and we're as a collective, and so all decisions are made as a group. And it became tedious for a while for especially administrative decisions. But I remember one of our company members, Evan, brought in this kind of like thing called fist to five, which is just once you have time to discuss everything, everybody kind of goes around the room and you hold up your hand. And you're either a fist or a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And 1 through 4 means 1 is I hate it, but I'm not going to argue about it anymore. I've let my feelings be known. And a 4 is I love it. I'm not captain of this, but I love it. And 5 means I love it so much that I'm going to fight for it. And fist means I hate it so much that I'm going to fight against it. And so it makes you choose in your mind just how much are you willing to really, if you really want something to happen, you should be willing to make it happen, to really coach people, to really help people see your vision and that sort of thing. And I think that really helps. That model, once it entered my head, just even in a 2-person collaboration, really helps me understand where I stand on things of like, yeah, Janina seems really convinced on this and I trust her. And so rather than my own feeling of like, I think sometimes when I don't want to do something in a collaboration, it's because it's out of my comfort zone. It's not something I would have written. It's not a thing I would do. And so you just learn to trust the other person to be like, well, they seem really convicted, so I bet it works.
I mean, I love that. I love the fist to 5 thing. I'm definitely going to steal that because I think sometimes it's like, you're both just like, I really care about this. And it's like, it's nice to be able to enumerate that.
Yeah.
Is there anything, obviously the footnotes were a point of discussion between the two of you. Is there anything else you can think of where you like really didn't agree at first, or one of you really had to convince the other? Maybe without too many spoilers, maybe move on.
The biggest points of discussion were we went back and forth on the ending a bit. So I don't want to go into details about what happens, but there were a couple of different versions, and we went back and forth on how that all panned out and what happened to Miriam and where she ended up. And and then but other than that, I think it was mostly like there were scenes that one of us had deleted and the other one wanted to hold on to. There was Jeffrey wrote this beautiful meet cute between Miriam and her wife Teresa, and then I was like, we need to, like when I went back after reading his first draft of that section of the book, I was like, we need to do more with that. Like that hasn't, like he started something beautiful and then we needed to flesh that out a bit more. But yeah, I think for the most part it was the ending that was had the most back and forth over.
Yeah, and that one was, it wasn't the big picture of the ending. It was some kind of like very specific details about a couple of characters. And yeah, it was interesting. And it was also kind of happening. It was happening very close to when we told the publisher we'd turn it in. And so they probably just made the arguments more intense because you don't have as much time to be like, I don't know, let's just leave it there.
Yeah. Well, I think you guys did a good job on the ending, I have to say. It gave me just as much as I needed to know, but not so much that I walked away from the book completely satisfied. And I actually feel like that's the mark of a stronger book because it really stuck with me. And after I finished reading it, I actually went to like read another book because I'm always reading something, and I found that I actually couldn't for a few days because I know it's the greatest compliment. I really just wanted to sit with what I had just digested. And it's very rare that happens, but I was like, I'm not ready to move on yet. And I think, that's a testament in a lot of ways to the ending, and that it is something that, it sticks with you, and it carries an emotional weight that I think is really, really affecting. So whatever the debates were, you ended in a good place.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
For
That's
me, at
really,
least.
that's maybe one of the nicest compliments I've ever had. That's really great.
Well, other people might disagree, but I definitely enjoyed the ending. We have a question from the audience here about the Institute itself and its location, which is kind of referred to as being near the Chesapeake Bay. Did you guys have a specific location in mind for the Institute and for kind of some of the settings of the book in general, or do you want it to be kind of vague?
Yeah, it's a difficult thing because we kind of play around with being like vague, but the Institute, we always kind of knew where it was. Like, I think that was a point of discussion back in season 1 of the podcast, because I was picturing something in my head and Jeffrey was picturing something else, and there was a point in the writing where we were like, we've been picturing different things and we need to lock down where this is actually but it's I feel like I'm not automatically good at like figuring out where things are physically. I'm not a particularly visual person, so for the locations of the book in general, I had to sit on Google Maps and like draw like plot along a space of where I think things are happening, particularly in the first part where she's like sort of moving around in Europe. And the point is for that to be vague. Like, she never says where she is, and no one ever seems to know where she has been except for a couple of times. But yeah, I was like, what is actually reasonable? what might have worked? Which is it doesn't come naturally to me, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I thought. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I'm sorry, I have a cat attacking me. This Barry needs to be part of all of this. Yeah, I mean, it was somewhat of an arbitrary decision to set it sort of near Chesapeake Bay. Just trying to pick an area that could, that area, to me, I guess it was not totally arbitrary, but like, to me, it's near the nation's capital. It's near Annapolis, right? Like, it's near a major military institution, things of that nature. So it just seemed kind of like this was kind of in and around the area that would have been, at least in America, some kind of like central governmental headquarters. But also, if you go out onto the peninsulas, you start getting further and further away into the country. It seemed like a place you could sort of hide something as like a giant warehouse looking thing or whatever.
Yeah, that makes sense. That definitely makes sense. And I appreciate you mentioning too in the beginning of the book all the different locations around Europe, and that you were sitting on Google Maps, because I was wondering there, when it's like the footnote, will say, oh, she was probably near Belgium or whatever, and I'm like, can you walk from there to there? I don't know. I was like, I'm a second away from pulling out my Google Maps and like, where or she heading east or west or down? So I definitely pictured you too with like maps and pins and like hair falling out, just stressed out. Like, but I mean, I think it was really powerful, speaking to kind of the world that you created and the dissolution of boundaries, and like how bounded we are now, and how those things didn't even exist in the book, in the world where Miriam was growing up. Hold on, we have another viewer question. Oh wait, I can't actually see it. Huh, that's weird. It just popped up.
It's in the chat.
Oh, I think it's in the chat.
Maybe it's in the chat.
Q&A.
Yeah. Oh, got it. Okay, cool. Here's a question for you from the audience, from Michael. Thank you, Michael. What fascinates me is references in the post-Great Reckoning society to people and artifacts from our world. That's great. So they're having trouble wrapping their head around those things and people and how they're different. So in your imaginations, when you refer to things in the book that exist in the real world, in the world that we're aware of, are you picturing them the same, or are you picturing them as kind of altered by this new kind of sideways reality that we've entered into?
I think that they're definitely not quite the same, but they're like a version of themselves exists in the society, which, doesn't necessarily track logically given the degree of just death, like the amount of people, like the chances of people being the same, just because no one in their lineage had died, are pretty slim. But I don't really care. It's a book, it's fiction, and it's nice to have some touch points, I think. And I don't want to write about a world where Ursula Le Guin wasn't it just seems a step too grim. But yeah, it's definitely there are some things. I think at one point in the podcast we referenced V for Vendetta. I definitely don't think that's the same book as our one, because it's not the same political climate, but I think it's driven by what would those impulses look like in that world. And I like having those similar touch points. We did have a point, I think, in one of the edits where I think we mentioned at some point one of Theresa's dresses being worn on a red carpet, and we mentioned, I can't remember who we said was wearing it, but we had a note being like, this is a real person, and I was like, yes.
I think Susie and the Banshees are still the same. We referenced them in season 1. But it made more sense as we've done the podcast and then as we were doing the book to have a few of those real world artists or people there. And we more specifically choose artists, whether they're musicians or actors or painters or whatever. Rather than like real world politicians, because like the political landscape and the population has changed. But in having the touchstones in our mind of like, this kind of gives you a sense, rather than having to describe an artist that is very similar to Louise Bourgeois, let's just say Louise Bourgeois exists here. Instead of having to describe a band similar to Susie and the Banshees, let's just say Susie and the Banshees exists here. And if you know who that is, then you can kind of get what that is, vaguely.
More than that, I think it also really grounds the story in an interesting way that I think makes the choice to have this kind of like parallel universe, it feels a little more surreal because it is familiar and there is that uncanny familiarity with it, and yet it is completely unrecognizable. And I think that's aided by these references and allusions to things that we do recognize for sure. So this question is kind of just more of a me question that possibly people who have heard you talk about your podcast already know, but I'm curious, as I was reading it, I'm glad you didn't do this, but and I know that the book is based on the podcast, so obviously the two are a unit, but clearly can be enjoyed separately, as I did. What was the decision like to set it in this kind of parallel world that is also in the past, because I think as I was beginning to read it, I was like, this could so easily be near future, this like slight dystopia, and yet you kind of chose to set it in this sideways past. And can you guys talk about that decision a little bit, obviously coming from the podcast as well?
Well, the podcast has always been an anthology series just set in the same world. So we started building out this world with season 1, and we just like playing around in it. And I think of it as like, there are a lot of authors that just maybe just more sort of contemporary realist authors who just populate their books with characters from the other ones. Like Maeve Binchy has her Dublin, and people cross paths from other books, and they're all standalone, but it over time, if you read a lot of her, and it gives you this grounding of this proper universe. Or Ian Banks had the Culture series, and it's just, here are some stories that are set in this one thing, and that's what I feel like we're doing. We're just over time building out this world more and more, and we like playing around in it and seeing what people do there. Because I think it's just, I don't know, I find that exciting to look at places that are a bit weird and just like off kilter from what we know, and think about what that means for people and how they live their lives.
Yeah, I think when we were first starting the show, it was kind of like when the television series Fargo was kind of getting going as well, and I became really fascinated with the idea of just doing an anthology series where it's just, okay, well, I understand these are all in the same world and they don't have to connect at all. They really don't, but there is some connective thread. I mean, there's something sort of fun about if you play like an open world video game, especially like I remember years back of like playing whatever the GTA that was very much based on New York City and being like, okay, let's can I go to my apartment? And that sort of thing. It's just sort of fun to see how those things one connect to, there's like a thin veil between this fictional timeline and our actual timeline, but also like if somebody listens to every single season of our podcast and also reads the book, it's fun to see a character that gets mentioned in a certain way. It reminds me of like being in a city that I've only been to once before, walking in what I think is a totally different area, and then I pop upon a neighborhood that I'm like, this is where I was last time. Not my map of the city is so much larger now.
Yeah. I love that. So that leads into, does that mean we can expect more in this universe? Are you guys planning another book in this universe? Are you planning other projects that aren't maybe just more of the show? Or
we're definitely not stopping anytime soon.
Great.
I think we'll probably keep telling stories here. I mean, for as long as we find it fun, and for as long as anyone wants to listen to them or read them or publish them. Yeah. We don't have a specific plan for another book yet, but if they want us to do another one, we will.
Bask in this one for a little bit longer.
Yeah.
No pressure, but I need another book in the world.
Okay, great.
We'll know that down.
It doesn't have to be a sequel. They can just touch, at certain points, just like you said. I love that as well.
Yeah.
Something else that I personally took a lot of interest in the book, and again, I don't want to spoiler too much, so tell me to shut up if I'm saying too much. But let's talk about trauma. Let's talk about the watercolor quiet. Let's talk about, like, I was so excited when I started reading this, and you kind of started to dig into the nature of trauma and the nature of memories, because so much of it reminded me of literally the trauma work that I've done in therapy, and kind of the more recent brain spotting EMDR view of traumatic memories and how we can kind of treat them in a way that we haven't ever thought of before. And I thought it was so fascinating to see some of those ideas in this book, but 100 years ago. And I was like, oh wow, what if we could have done this earlier, and where would it have led us? And I guess we got our answer. But can you guys speak a little bit more to that, like the ideas behind this kind of methodology that Miriam comes up with, and just trauma in general?
Oh yeah, let's talk about trauma. Sure.
Yeah, it's a fun topic. That's why I'm putting it in the middle. We gotta go deep, and then we'll joke some more, and then
it's the trauma sandwich.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's one of those interesting. I think I tend to have personally kind of a clinical and cold attitude to my own experiences of trauma. I detach quite easily, which is probably bad, and I should probably talk to someone about that. But like, I find it very interesting to think of the way that our brains work physiologically, and even in things like, I don't know, I was had a terrible time at school, had terrible self-esteem, and so I started like planning out thoughts for myself in the way that, spoilers, but someone does at some point, because I think we, thinking can be a pattern, and can we hack the pattern, I think is an interesting, and I have found useful over an extremely long period of time. It takes a really long time to break bad thinking patterns. But yeah, I don't know. I think the idea of like, can you teach your brain where to go when, it goes where it goes, but can you stop it and redirect it? And like, what does that do to you? And how does that affect you? And I don't think that it's for everyone, but it's definitely helped me in some aspects of my life. But then I think it also can be, I don't know, that I think we're kind of telling a lie there in reality. Obviously it's science fiction. This isn't a thing that you can do in real life, but I don't know the difference between detaching and suppressing something. And if you suppress something, it's going to come back like at some point. So I would say don't do the watercolor quiet in your own life, just do actually go to therapy instead.
To a professional.
Yeah.
Not maybe not by the name of Miriam.
Yeah. I was really fascinated with the idea of somebody who would invent a process that at its core is a very noble invention, right? Like that is a truly, like, I don't even know if I would say altruistic, because I don't know if that's necessarily Miriam's nature, but that Miriam found a path for herself in a creation that she cobbled together from other people's ideas, how we often create things, but with every change in our behavior societally, it changes. When a cell phone gets invented, it completely changes the way in which we communicate and the way in which we talk, and it shapes the language, it shapes the way we treat each other. And I think that I was very curious as we were writing this book to kind of see how this watercolor quiet changes all of society, right? Because it's a pretty dramatic invention if spread the way that she begins to spread that sort of thing. And the trick to all of it, like the technical side of writing the watercolor quiet as a process for treating trauma and treating memory, had to do with, like, we went back and forth on, like, it was not in an argument way, but in both of us trying to figure out how to explain how it works. And then we ultimately, Janina was like, Janina had the best way of framing it, which was just that, like, I don't think we have to. Like, it's not really interesting if you read a book about magic, about magicians, and they explain how magic works. Like, it just works, and in some ways the watercolor quiet is more of a spell than it is a scientific process. And and I think that was sort of an interesting way of, like, finding the right wording to not go into like really technical approaches that we have now. I don't want to get into a place where we have actual psychologists being like, this would never work. Like, it's not supposed to.
It's not supposed to. It's magic.
Yeah.
The crazy thing is, I think it actually would work, which is a little terrifying.
Yeah.
And I'm not a psychologist, so, like, don't quote me as an expert, but, like, having experienced a lot of trauma work in my life, there is a certain amount of reprogramming that's done where you do kind of have different emotional responses to your traumatic memories. And that's kind of just the tip of kind of what Miriam creates. But what's fascinating to me is that you guys took it kind of all the way. And it felt to me like that, expanding on, like, okay, well, what if, it's interesting you say Miriam's not necessarily altruistic, because I definitely got that vibe that she was just more than anything, like, curious. And it's kind of like, what if there was, like, a message that you guys kind of had about her or about her life, like, would it be about, like, the idea of, like, curiosity going too far, or kind of like, how much do you think she is to blame, or do you think that ultimately, she was really just in it for the science, and everything else is kind of out of her hands, without giving away too many spoilers?
I think that's the thing about all scientific development, right? Like, we create these powerful tools, and I don't think it's particularly common that we appreciate at that point of creation what they can actually be used for. I mean, the internet is a great example of this, right? It was just this practical thing that enables people to connect across space, and isn't that exciting? And no one could have predicted how truly horrific the fallout from that could be, and, like, what could happen because of that. And I think that is just, we can't stop moving forward. We can't stop developing things. They do have incredibly powerful positive impacts often, but we also never know if they're going to be entirely harmless. And I think that I don't think there's an answer to that question. I think, do you blame the scientists who develop, something that is supposed to keep people safe, and then someone finds a way to use that for harm? I think it's too big a question to have an easy answer. And I only know the easy answers.
I think of Miriam too as, like, she is curious, but I think think early on, the thing that I was realizing about her character and the way she describes her childhood is just that even despite the war, even despite the Great Reckoning happening, you don't recognize it as an apocalypse at first. You just keep living your life. Somebody else, some other man in a uniform somewhere is making or a suit or whatever is making the choice for people to die, and I just live my life. And I think there's a mother courage sort of element to that. Like, I'm not necessarily that she's a profiteer off of war, but just a person who continues to do their job despite everything around them. And I think I was really curious to play around with that in writing her character too, that even as people are moving in to say, we want to use this to do this, we want to change this and do this, she's just like, I just need room to do what I'm trying to do. And sometimes that's great of somebody who knows their lane, but sometimes you get passed up by everyone else who takes over, tries to take over what you do.
Yeah, I also think it's one of those things that, well, like what's going on in the book is it is the trauma that she's dealing with is a shared trauma. It has individual aspects with each person, but it is shared, which obviously everyone in the world understands a little about now, because we've been living in that. But it's one of those situations where everyone is like, this is the situation for everyone, and this is the way I'm contributing, and it's my life, and it's also my part in this bigger puzzle. But it's not a puzzle that's happening. It's much more chaotic than that. So all of these people making these big decisions with Miriam's technology are also just like doing their one job that's in front of them to do, and no one person is really in charge of like taking a moment to think about this wider impact, because that's not really how people function. And it's only after the fact that you can look at those sorts of things and the questions that you think you should have asked beforehand, but really you couldn't have asked because you didn't have that opportunity because you didn't know everything that you know now.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a great consistency in her character from childhood to adulthood where she really does. It is a very central like survival focus when she's out of maybe immediate danger, she's still very much in her lane and very much like this is what I'm doing and I'm just going to push forward and, without necessarily stepping back. And in a way you kind of point to the idea of like this abstract theoretical thought as a privilege that, people who grew up during this great reckoning, like she couldn't have the larger abstract thought as she's literally trying to feed herself as a child alone, in war-torn Europe. And so, and you kind of see how that carries into adulthood. And I think that's really interesting as well, that kind of consistency in character as someone who is creating so much change around her. She herself doesn't actually seem to change that much.
Yeah, which I think is partly because we're very bad at recognizing how we have changed. She's writing down her view of herself as a child, as she is an adult, as she's an elderly person. And it's, I don't know, when I picture myself at 3, I don't picture myself at 3, I picture myself as now, but tiny. It's very easy to forget how we felt about things and how we responded to things because we're not the same people that we were. And yet, it's
I think that's a great point. Yeah
Everything
is kind of through the lens of her current experience.
I thought about that a lot when we finished the first rough draft of like thinking about, she would have written all of this at once probably. She would have written this in her older age rather than writing this throughout her life. Like a lot of memoirs are written, obviously all memoirs written after the fact. You don't write them before the fact, but still, but you write them in essentially like one sitting over the course of months or maybe a year or two, but it might encompass many decades of your life. And in her case from childhood. And I couldn't help but to think a little bit about, she talks a lot in this book about how fallible memory is, that like memory oxidizes when exposed to air, when brought into the light. The more often you bring it out into the light, the more likely it is to tarnish, to change, to melt, to shift its shape. And so it's sort of curious. It does beg the question of like just how much of her memory is just her, as Janina said, placing her 80-something-year-old self onto this 8-year-old self from before, just being like, oh, I'm just a tiny 80-year-old way back when.
Yeah.
Which ties back into the footnotes, right? And this kind of evaluation of like how true are her statements, and how much has she maybe lost perspective. I think it's interesting, you know, I wrote a memoir when I was 26 based on my early 20s. And it was extremely hard for myself to get into my own mindset that was only 4 years old at the time. And I struggled to like find who I was when I was, you know, 22 and kind of portray that. Did you have any kind of maybe like rituals or kind of like things you did to help get into Miriam's mindset? Because obviously you're co-writing from kind of the same voice and the same perspective. How did you kind of find yourself in her character, and how were you kind of able, do you have like a big document of her entire life, or kind of how did you know, enmesh yourself into her experience?
We're not that organized. I think for me, that not so much having a ritual, but going over the text so many times and like trying to figure out who she is. And I for me, that sort of stuff often happens in the later processes when it becomes like when you're going through the copy edits and things, and you're asked to sort of justify, or not justify because you just click yes or no on the edits, but like you have to think about like, why is she speaking in this way? Why does this sentence not have the clarity of like proper formal language? Like, why is she breaking here and why is she doing that? And it's when you start to really focus in on those details, for me, when I start to think about like who she is in that moment when she's writing things down, and who was she in that moment when it was happening, and how does that connect? I think that's like that. I have a more fine-tuning approach to that sort of side of things, I think. Yeah, I don't know if Jeffrey is the same or different.
I think for me in writing, it's a little bit different in writing like a podcast or a stage play or whatever, where I might like say things out loud over and over again because they're going to be read out loud, that I'm sort of trying to embody the character. For the book, for novel writing, for me, it's more about language than anything else. This is like when I'm getting started, like if I'm picking back up and I haven't, if I've taken a day or two off of working on a chapter or two, I'll just go back and just reread, at least get another, couple thousand words just to read to myself to kind of get the voice in me. And I think that once I have the language down, there's just sort of a pattern to how people talk. And I think for me, the personality and the choices and the rationale of the character come from the language. I don't know if that's working in reverse, but Janina wrote wrote the introduction and started, wrote most all of the footnotes. And by getting that started, once I sort of like had this to read off of, like, now I get it. Now I see this language. I see how this person writes. And it became a lot easier to sort of understand that character. So if I just go back and kind of read, it's sort of my ramp up time rather than
like sink into it. Yeah, that makes
I don't
sense.
have to think motivation like I do when I'm writing a play.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah, I remember in high school, I used to, if I was reading like Jane Austen and then I would try to write something, I would like write it like Jane Austen. It was subconscious. So that actually makes total sense, that you can just kind of get into that mindset in a way that's useful and doesn't make you look like an asshole in high school. I want to shout out to the audience. I know some of you have been posting your questions, but we've got just about 10 minutes left, I believe. So if anyone has any questions, you can shoot them over in the Q&A to make sure that Jeffrey and Janina can answer them. Just want to call that out so I don't end up, eating up all the time. I always hate it when people do that when I go to things. So I would hate to do it to the lovely people here.
It's such call out culture that we have here. Yeah. It is funny having done a couple of these. This is the release day of our book, but we had one of these on Sunday as well. And I had another book that came out last year during pandemic time, so we were on Zoom for book events. And it is very funny because I've done live book events before as both the author and attendee, and it's interesting though, like the there's a more like a more shyness, maybe, I don't know if it's shyness or whatever, to ask questions on Zoom than in person. And I've always the dynamic in person is always interesting because nobody will do it, and then somebody breaks the seal and they pop up, and then suddenly you have like 12 questions in a 15-person audience or whatever. You're like, all right, let's do this. So anyways,
Absolutely.
not to shame anyone.
We're not shaming anyone. The questions we've gotten so far have been good. But yeah, I will say in person there's a definite energy that builds that I think helps, the discussion that I think unfortunately is lacking on Zoom sometimes.
Yeah.
But that's why I'm being extra bouncy. I'm bringing the energy for everyone. Also drank like way too much. I nervous drink, and I've been nervous drinking my coffee that I didn't mean to finish. So I'm like extra caffeinated. Great. All right. Well, let's see. Do I have any remaining questions? I feel like we hit everything that I wanted to hit personally. Is there anything that you two want to say about the book, about the process, about your secret, gripes about each other, embarrassing stories while writing?
We're pretty aggressively antanistic towards each other all the time.
I can definitely tell. I'm getting hostile vibes on this. I didn't want to say anything, but it's
we've got to lock that down. We've got to get better at hiding our pain and rage.
I'm just really perceptive. It's just me. I think you've hidden it from most people pretty well. So.
Yeah, it's just because you're a writer too, so you know how to like observe people.
I can feel that. Yeah, I just people watch constantly. So
well, I'll take a moment to say again that like I met you, Isa, through Andy Scahill, the professor, and he introduced me to you earlier this year. We did a horror movie podcast, and it was really fun. And he introduced me to your movie Cam that you wrote, and it came out in 2018. So I'll just reiterate: if you don't even have to have Netflix, but I know it's on Netflix, and I think a lot of people have it, but go buy it or rent it off iTunes or wherever you get your movies. But Cam is great. And even if you're like horror squeamish, like I kind of am, like I think you can do it. I think it's great. And I think it's just such a smart, inventive horror movie. Anyway, so I just thought if we had a couple minutes, I would throw that out there and a pitch for Cam.
There's a +1 for that. It's fantastic. I watched it for the first time. I think the last time I was in New Zealand visiting my family. My partner was just like, do you want to watch this weird indie horror film that I've heard of? I was like, no, why not? And then it bangs.
Yeah. Thank you.
Really, yeah.
Thank you. I very much appreciate that. Coming from you too, it's a great compliment. So thank you. I can't take like dying now, so back to you.
What a beautiful place to end this, and like a glowing love fiesta. Thank you all so much. This was a spectacular conversation. I know folks are going to be really excited to read the book if they haven't yet already. I will remind everyone that we do have some signed copies that have been signed by both Janina and Jeffrey at oblongbooks.com. So check that out, or go order it from your local independent bookstore. Make sure they know about it and are excited about it too. You feel it just below the ribs. Oh my gosh.
So good.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Isa, also for really pulling it all together into such a great discussion.
I mean, of course. Thanks for having me. And thank you, Janina and Jeffrey, for writing this book, because I mean, it's my favorite I've read this year so far. So and I'm not just saying that, like I legitimately read it so fast. It's so good. So thanks for making weird stuff, and keep making weird stuff. And anytime you want to talk about weird stuff, let's do it.
Awesome. Sold.
Fantastic. Thank you all for joining us. Everybody have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, Suzanna. Bye,
Thank
y'all.
you.
Bye.